Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our newest installment of our Evolution of Mindfulness speaker series. So my name is Frances Sadi, and I am the Associate Director of Non-Degree Programs here at Brown University's School of Professional Studies. It really is wonderful to see so much energy around today's topic. We had just under 2,000 people register for today's talk, consisting of individuals from around the world, representing a wide range of disciplines and global communities, which I think really speaks to just how resonant this conversation is right now. So whether you are a clinician, educator, researcher, mindfulness teacher, or teacher in training, or really someone who's just simply exploring how these practices show up in daily life, we are so glad that you are here. So the Evolution of Mindfulness speaker series was created to explore how mindfulness continues to evolve, how practices rooted in ancient contemplative traditions are now being adapted into evidence-based programs, integrated into healthcare systems, and shaped by emerging tools like apps, neurofeedback, and even artificial intelligence. Here at the School of Professional Studies, our mission is to offer rigorous yet flexible professional programs that help people lead meaningful change in their fields, communities, and personal lives. Our mindfulness offerings, developed in partnership with the Mindfulness Center at Brown University's School of Public Health, reflect that mission. Together, we aim to deliver high-quality, research-informed mindfulness-based programming that supports individual well-being, professional development, and the broader movement towards collective care. And over the past year, we've had the honor to host a number of leaders in the mindfulness field, including MBSR founder Jon Kabat-Zinn, as well as Richie Davidson, Zindel Siegel, Isabel Roth, and more recently, Dr. Liz Hoagie. So today's session is titled Ancient Wisdom, Modern Tools, How Mindfulness Meets Apps, AI, and Neurofeedback. It's a timely and nuanced conversation, especially as many in our community hold important questions and even concerns about how emerging technologies intersect with contemplative practices. While tools like digital therapeutics and AI offer real potential to expand access and support, they also raise significant ethical questions about relationship, presence, privacy, and power. So we approach today's conversation not as a definitive answer, but as an invitation to reflect, to question, and to stay rooted in mindfulness itself as we navigate the evolving landscape. And to get a sense of where our audience today stands on these issues, we'd love to just start off with a brief one-question poll. So I will launch that question now and give you a chance to respond. The question we have is, in your opinion, can AI ever play a meaningful role in supporting mindfulness practice? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. Great, we'll wait till about 80% have participated, and I'll share those results. All right, closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much. And it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing a bell curve here, shifting more towards really leaning towards possibly using AI and having AI play a meaningful role in supporting mindfulness practices, but certainly with others a little bit more on the skeptical or unsure end as well. I'm going to stop sharing that. Great. So to that end, I will shift gears, and we are really honored to welcome Dr. Jud Brewer, known to many as Dr. Jud. He is a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and New York Times bestselling author, and serves as the Director of Research and Innovation here at the Mindfulness Center at Brown University. Dr. Jud's work has transformed how we understand habit loops, anxiety, and the brain's role in healing, and he's an innovator. Jud has spent the past decade or more developing digital tools and app-based interventions that are now being used worldwide. And joining Jud in conversation today is Dr. Eric Laux, Director of the Mindfulness Center at Brown. Eric will guide the dialogue for the next half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up for a time of audience question and answer. So we will be pulling questions from the audience, both with some questions that people submitted in advance, as well as taking some live questions as well. So we invite you to use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen throughout the talk to submit your questions. And also just a quick note that today's session is being recorded, and we will share a link via our YouTube channel after the event. And then with that, it's my pleasure to hand things over to Eric and Jud. Thank you both so much for being here today. And thank you to everyone online who took time out of your day to join us. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Jud, for being here. And, I think we have some of our best conversations while floating on surfboards out in the ocean, having some fun and being out in nature and getting exercise. And I'm almost like picturing us out there right now. We couldn't get the film crew out on the waves today, but let's enjoy this conversation. I know I certainly will. And I think recruiting you to Brown and seeing you flourish here in so many ways, to me, I see you as one of the most innovative mindfulness researchers that I'm aware of. Even like blazingly innovative, I would say. It feels like often you're, 5 years ahead of the majority of researchers that I'm aware of, and I really respect that in you. And I know you're shifting into the next wave of innovation, including artificial intelligence. And I also feel like, publications are often old by the time they get released because the thinking's happening right now. You're seeing the initial results right now, and then it takes time to write it all up and then to put it into peer review and to get it out. So I think, especially with digital therapeutics, having someone like you here allows folks to really get the pulse of what's going on, and also the future of mindfulness and digital therapeutics as well. So really, thanks for being here, and look forward to our conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. With this speaker series, we typically provide a similar question to begin each with, and also a similar question to end. So the question that we typically ask to begin of all of our speakers is, what first led you to mindfulness?
Suffering. Yeah, I was pretty stressed out at the end of my undergraduate years and starting medical school. So stressed out that I had got irritable bowel syndrome. I didn't know that it was related to stress until I learned that. And that's, I was very fortunate because somehow full catastrophe living landed in my lap right before I started medical school. So I started, there are these things called cassette tapes, and I was listening to those, started my first day of medical school. Yeah,
First day.
that's where it started. First day, I was like,
Huh?
new chapter in my life.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
And at the time you were studying like immunology, because you did an MD PhD. I remember you were first in immunology, right? And then what shifted you to, there's always the personal practice of mindfulness, and then there's the professional. And what had you shift to the professional side?
So the work I was doing in grad school, I was really interested in like why we get sick when we're stressed type of thing.
Yeah.
So my PhD was formally in immunology, but we looked at these neuroimmune endocrine interactions in mouse models. And,
Yeah.
it was interesting and we learned a lot. And and still remember toward the end of my training there that somebody said, "Oh, so how does this apply to humans?" And I was like, I don't know because these are mice. So that was a piece. There was another piece from an ethical perspective where I was, I've been practicing in the tradition for about 8 years by the time I finished schooling, and I just didn't feel comfortable killing mice anymore.
Mm.
And so I stopped doing that. And I remember starting residency, thinking, okay, well, I've got a couple of years to figure out what I want to do for research, but it's not going to be mouse models.
Mhm.
And as I was going through residency and also through the, MD PhD is like you do a couple of years of med school and then you do your PhD for long enough to forget everything you learned in med school. And then you go back on the wards. So I was back on the wards trying to figure out what specialty I was going to do, what I liked in medicine. And I was learning from my patients that like they were speaking the same language that I've been learning in my Buddhist practice. So like this can't be a coincidence, and really just loved psychiatry, loved the addiction piece. Just felt like I could relate to people really well. and wanted help. There's a lot of suffering there with addiction. So ended up going into psychiatry residency, and then just, trying to just keep my head above water for the first couple of years of residency. But also I was at Yale, so they have this neuroscience research training programs where they give us a little bit of space to be able to do research during residency. And I said, you know what? I had this itch that I had to scratch. And I was like, I'm going to study mindfulness. I remember somebody in residency who said, you're going to kill your career doing this. And I remember making this leap of faith. It's like, well, I'd rather do something that I'm really passionate about than just, do what I've done this other stuff. So I'd rather just go for this and try it and not have any regrets. And it was at a time where you didn't know where the field was going to go because it was very early. And, who knew that we were going to have this whole mindfulness movement or whatever people call it
Yeah.
over the last couple of decades.
Yeah. Yeah. The scientific philosopher Thomas Kuhne, who wrote that book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about how early on in a field, researchers are often met with a lot of skepticism. And and then after time, if there's something really there, it becomes a hot topic.
Mm.
And then after that, it's met with, oh, of course that's true. And so sometimes I was also met with skepticism by some administrators where I was working. And in some ways, that's almost good news if we hear that,
Yeah.
because it suggests that we're early on enough that the innovation is there. And in time, is got to test the hypotheses really well with good methods. And if there's something there, then it becomes a hot topic, and then it becomes part of clinical care or public health guidelines. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. It's funny. I almost look at it as, when we're trying to publish a paper on it, kind of a newer concept, if it doesn't get rejected immediately, it's not avant-garde enough. It's not pushing the edge enough. But
yeah,
like reliably, some of especially our most formative stuff, it got rejected once, twice, three times because people are like, this can't possibly be true. Or what are you talking about?
yes, yeah, yeah. Great. Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. And maybe talk a little more around, as it continued to evolve, how you got into, say, the neuroimaging side of things, and then how that continued to lead into the digital therapeutics evolution.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. I remember, I was started my careers and just stayed at Yale after residency, had a really great mentor there, Bruce Rounsville. And he basically said, I don't care what you study as long as you study it well. And he was a great mentor for like helping me with methodology because I had to retool to learn clinical studies. I had to retool to learn neuroimaging. And I remember sitting in a meeting with him and another mentor, Mark Potenza, and I don't remember, this is probably around 2007, 2008. And they said, why don't you do a study of like, look at the neuroimaging of, look at the brain activity in meditators. And I was thinking, at the time, Antoine Lutz and Richie Davidson had published some of the first studies. And I was thinking, oh, well, it's probably already been done. But when we went back and looked, like people hadn't really done a definitive study, just like a straightforward cross-sectional, like compare expert meditators to novices. And so we did that. And long story short, we got some really interesting findings when we looked across a bunch of different types of meditations. This is where this default mode network came into play. But what got me into neuroimaging was two things, or the neurofeedback was two things. One, I happened to be at Yale, and there was a guy, Zenius Papademetris, and his grad student at the time, Dustin Shinost, and they were starting to develop these neurofeedback methodologies because there's not available. There were just a couple of places that were doing it. And I remember they were using gaming cards where there's this special card that will process things really quickly. And so they could actually apply, they're like, wow, you can use these gaming cards to make really cool fast processors for the neuroimaging because there's a ton of data that you're collecting every 2 seconds. And so they had to solve that problem. So they solved that problem. And when our studies came out, I wanted to replicate them first and foremost, but I also wanted to, really bridge this subjective, objective, first person, third person gap where first person is somebody's subjective experience. And with neuroimaging, you're seeing these brain regions or networks activate or deactivate or whatever. But there's this reverse inference problem in neuroimaging where you can see something happen in the brain, but you don't know how that's lining up with subjective experience. And I was thinking, wow, neurofeedback could be a great way to bridge that gap and bring people's subjective experience together with their brain activity. And I have to say that was one of the most fascinating, several years that we had. Typically people will, set up a study and send their postdoc or grad student down to collect the data. And I remember thinking, I'll stop going to the scans when I stop learning something. I went to every single scan because I learned something from every single subject. Because they report back on their brain activity, how it was lining up with their subjective experience. And we were just learning so much about how this all of this was unfolding. And at the same time, we really found some interesting things around the nuance of default mode network deactivation with meditation, where it wasn't just like, people are thinking, well, what's happening when this brain network is getting quiet? And we were starting to line up these qualitative experiences where people were saying, when they were curious, when they were observing, when they were, it wasn't like their brains were going quiet in the terms of thinking. It was how they were interacting with their thoughts. And some of them, I still remember we had some novices, where it's like their brain activity was going nuts because they're supposed to meditate, and we see this default mode network activity because they're trying to meditate. I remember one after 9 minutes, this novice, it looked like he totally flipped it. It went from like all really active to really deactivated. And he said, "Oh, I noticed the difference between thinking about breathing and paying attention to the physical sensations of breathing." Right. And so it was helping us see what in theory and in practice we can experience. But now these were some of the first data showing like how that was directly lining up with the brain. So that was just really fascinating. We learned a ton.
Yeah. 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 Your default mode paper has been cited almost 2,000 times.
Mm.
And so it's been a real contribution to the field in terms of replicated brain regions that show up time and time again with meditation practice. I think for listeners, if you want to see more about this work with Jud, Anderson Cooper did a 60-minute special on this, and you can see Anderson Cooper all like hooked up and getting the immediate biofeedback. It's a great episode. I think you can find it online. And also Michael Pollan wrote about it in his book, How to Change Your Mind. So just an example of the ripple effects of Judd's research when you're getting these kinds of folks sharing about it and writing it up. And
Yeah.
um,
Well,
now,
I'll have to
oh,
say that Michael Pollan's visit was very interesting because this book was on like he's trying all the different psilocybin-like
yeah.
molecules and then writing about them. And what we had him do was recall these experiences while he was getting neurofeedback so we could see how that recollection affected his default mode network activity. And just the recollection just totally bottomed it out. And he said, the recollection helped him get back into that experience, which he hadn't really played with much. He like did a trip, recovered from the trip, went on to the next thing.
Mhm.
And so I have to say it's interesting, sati to remember, And I think I don't know the suttas that well, but like there's often phrases around like recollection.
Right.
And here he was recalling, what the felt experience was of these trips. And that was enough to kind of drop him into the momentary experience. Really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Makes me think of like with the therapist assisted psychedelic approaches these days, how folks can get these insights during those moments, and then how do we continue to foster whatever insights arrived to continue to manifest afterwards, and how meditation can often be an approach to continue to keep that fresh and keep those neural networks operating. And
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I know before we got on, you were talking about you're just at a conference where, everyone's talking about AI and mindfulness. I know you've been going into this domain a lot. I know a number of people here are aware of like the digital therapeutics that you have developed. And we're 20 minutes in or so, and I know folks are really interested in the AI stuff right now too. So, you know, be curious to hear a little bit more about your journey into the digital therapeutic side and also what you feel the audience would most appreciate hearing in terms of what you're seeing at the bleeding edge of this work right now.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep it. It's been over a decade now, so I'll keep the long story short. We got into the digital therapeutics somewhat serendipitously. I won't go into the details, but I was seeing as I was working in my clinic, I was at the VA hospital in West Haven, Connecticut at the time, and I was seeing, my patients out in the parking lot smoking because we're on a smoke-free campus. And I was thinking about these, I was doing a lot of habit change study at the time. We had just finished a big study on smoking cessation, where we'd found actually that mindfulness was 5 times better than gold standard at helping people quit smoking, which is really cool to see. And mechanistically, it fit beautifully with the Buddhist psychology, so that was really nice. And I started thinking like, well, how can I actually package my office to put it at people's fingertips? Because they don't, they come to my office maybe once a month, sometimes more often than that, but not that often. So we started playing, and also I had a mentor at Yale, Kathy Carroll, who is putting CBT online. At the time they were delivering it through the web. So we're like, well, let's just go right to people's phones. And so the idea was that we can take an evidence-based training, we can put it in a digital format so it's right at people's fingertips, and have it be 100% fidelity. So that was one thing. From a research standpoint, it's really appealing to have something that exactly what people are getting, and the exact dose that they're getting, because we can track every click. And we can also build in things like experience sampling, and so we can really, probe them in their life to see how, what the mechanisms have changed. So we spent several years developing these digital therapeutics, first for smoking, then eating, then even for anxiety, and you learned a ton, right? And even the eating program became one of the first CDC recognized diabetes prevention programs that's not based in cognitive frameworks, like cognitive therapy and things like that. That's really based in mindfulness, because there's enough evidence, not just ours, but from the field, contributing to showing that mindfulness, mechanistically can help people with eating. So, long story short, we found that here was a methodology that could be delivered digitally that could give people a psychoeducation component, and it could be delivered with high fidelity, and people seem to benefit. Like in our anxiety studies, our biggest randomized controlled trial, we got a 67% reduction in anxiety in people with generalized anxiety disorder. The control group had 14%. So it worked pretty well. And mechanistically, we could work out all the mechanisms. Yet, an app isn't enough, right? So we had paired this with online communities, a Zoom meeting that I led every Wednesday, which I really enjoyed. People from all over the world could join, where they could support each other, but also we could be supporting them. If they have questions, we could answer them. But the digital therapeutics are, I think there was a lot of promise at the time. And I say at the time because it almost feels like they are old now. But we developed, we've been doing this for 10 years, and we launched our anxiety program about in 2017. So that's like 8 years ago. It's ancient. And with these digital therapeutics, they're static delivery of content, right? We had to record the videos. It took a lot of time to program the apps. Now you can just, you pick which platform you want to use, and voila, you've got an app, So it's a whole different ballgame now. So we started asking this question, well, how can we make this more personal? How can we deliver this, not just to a lot of people, but really to each person, meeting them where they're at. And I'll give you a story. So I just got back from a conference last night, and I flew out there about 5 days ago. And I was flying from Boston to LA, and I was sitting next to a young woman, probably in her 20s. And when we took off from Boston, it wasn't even a crazy flight, but she was pretty nervous, and she put on the seat back guided meditation for calming, by some random person. And I shouldn't say some random person. I hope it was a good person. I just didn't know who the person was. And, she seemed to calm down a little bit. The rest of the flight was uneventful. And we start descending into LA, and, we're, slowing down, about to land. And then suddenly the plane goes like this, and it just takes off, and you can feel everybody go like this. And she crosses herself, grabs the seat, looks over at me. I've never seen so much sclera in a long time. Like, her eyes were so wide. And she goes, I'm really afraid right now. So I was trying to not to get in her business during the flight. I was like, okay, she's kind of anxious, but I'm gonna. So I was like, okay, permission to engage. And so I taught her 5 finger breathing, and she did it the rest of the flight until we landed. And we landed, and she turns to me and she goes, thank you. I'm so glad you were sitting next to me. And I was like, yeah, well, I was very glad to be of service, right? Well, not everybody gets to sit next to a psychiatrist, on a flight. So imagine all the other people on the flight, or all the people in the world where they suddenly have a panic attack or have an anxious, situation. It'd be great to have a doc in their pocket, so to speak, where they can pull it out. And it's not just like, okay, here's a meditation you can practice. Like here's a seat back meditation thing. She didn't go to the seat back. She needed something where somebody was meeting her where she was at. And so, I use that story because it's a perfect example of what we're starting to explore and what we've been, really trying to get our finger on the pulse of over the last year, which is like, okay, AI is here to stay. Like it or not, it's going to pull us with it. So we've got to ride this wave and learn how to ride it, as compared to getting washed by it. And so that's what we've been exploring. Like, how can we take these evidence-based treatments, and we actually just put a grant submission in for this. But the idea is, okay, we know how to deliver the psychoeducational components, and that needs to be delivered by a human. And I'll tell you why in a second. So we deliver those. We know how to do that. That's what we've done for 10 years. But we can have a digital teaching assistant that then goes and quizzes them on their content to make sure their comprehension is good, and it can bring in experiential education. Okay. We can also have a therapeutic assistant where it can be just in time treatment, where so if somebody's freaking out, it knows that they've already learned the 5 finger breathing because they learned it from the course. So it's got that in its memory, and it can say, oh, hey, are you anxious? Or no, if somebody, so they can pull out their phone and they can say, I'm really anxious right now. And it can say, hey, let's do 5 finger breathing, because it knows that they already know it.
Cool.
So that's kind of one of the frontiers that we're starting to explore. I'll pause there. I know I've been talking a lot, but I can give a couple of examples that have really really surprised me at how well this type of thing can function. And importantly, it's about having guardrails, right? Because there are a lot of ethical things that people need to consider. And from my standpoint as a clinician, it's really important that safety is there, because these things can be trained as they've inadvertently gotten trained to be sycophants just through the reinforcement learning with human feedback. It was a kind of a mistake, and be like, oh crap, but it's built into the system now. So these things have to have guardrails where you're not just training them on, the entire internet of English speaking words, but we're training them on, like, here's the specific process, here's the specific module that you're going to quiz them on, and here's how you're going to bring it into their life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I know you've launched a organization called Open Mind AI,
Mm.
and I'd be curious to hear more about the evolution of that and really what you're seeing. Like what's working that you feel as a clinician and a researcher that is both exciting and likely of service to society?
Okay, great question. Let's start with the clinician side of me, because we literally launched. So the first clinical program we just launched it, I think 3 weeks ago.
Mm,
And
yeah.
it's called Going Beyond Anxiety. So if folks are interested, they can just go to the website and check it out. But the idea is, I deliver. So with this clinically, I can be delivering new modules every week. So it's not like some static thing that we came up with 10 years ago. It's we can give them the core methodology. And we have actually learned from a lot of our qualitative research, like what's the best way to deliver this. So we've got this 3 gears method that you and I have talked about a lot, but just for, the long story short is, there's a clear stepwise methodology that people can use and that's what's led to these, good clinical results that we've had in our previous digital therapeutics. We actually compress that into a single, like, onboarding sequence where people get a series of lessons. And so they learn these gears right away. And then we say, okay, now every week you get a new topic where they get practices. We still have this live weekly group because I love it. And it's really helpful. but also we can give them summary things. And importantly, we can have them be quizzed with this or this teaching assistant. And what I really like about this is, so we tried to get people that didn't know our programs before to be our first, like our first cohort for this, and it didn't work. We have a lot of, we try to have a relatively small group, and now we're opening it up more because it seems to be working. But we've had people that have been with us for years, read books, done the apps or whatever, and it's really interesting to see how they're interacting with this teaching assistant. I'll read you a really short quote from somebody that just gave us some feedback on this, because I think it touches on this a little bit. Somebody said, I had a surprisingly insightful experience with a Dr. Jud, but I'm somewhat aversive to AI and have been most of, they said why, but I have some exposure to communities that are trying to apply it for good. So I'm trying to simply be curious to my experience. And I had much of the same positive experience of understanding the gears more clearly after having to explain or teach the bot what each of these gears meant, because the thing says, okay, explain this back to me in your own words, right? Which has been fascinating to watch people, because we get to read through these transcripts and see how people are doing this. And then they continued to say, applying these to a chosen habit, then we go into the experiential education. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's a way that this interaction slowed things down for me enough so that I was able to feel more deeply the results. And then she said, it feels strange to type that the bot helped me feel more deeply. Isn't that interesting? It felt strange to type that the bot helped me feel more deeply. I actually teared up a couple of times during the process. And so here's something that I never would have guessed, that like, here it is through this experiential education component, which I think MBSR teachers and others do extremely well. This, not that these bots are great at it, but we're starting to see hints that these things can work. So clinically, I'm really excited about this. Plus, it saves me a ton of time, because people can get the comprehension piece down, and then I get to do the inquiry, which is my favorite part, right? And so we can do inquiry on the live groups. From a research standpoint, this is a gold mine to really do these mixed methods studies, where we can not only look at the quantitative outcomes like GAD-7 scores and things like that, but we can look at the process of change, because we have every conversational turn when somebody's worked with the teaching assistant. And also, we haven't launched the therapeutic assistant yet, but when we do that, we'll be able to look at each turn, and then we can correlate those back to outcomes. So it's so fascinating. I'm just, as you can tell, I'm really excited about this. I never thought it would be this interesting. And one of the reasons we started doing this was like, okay, if we're going to keep up with AI, we have to do it, right? And there's nothing like being in the wading through the waters, just trying to deliver programs, and that's how you understand things well. So I'm really excited both clinically and from a research standpoint.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, because it's like with just an app, it might be pretty passive learning, but then when you engage with a teaching assistant bot, it's requiring people to synthesize and then report back, and that in itself is a form of learning, because you're having to like not only take it in, but now put it back out. And then another form of learning is to be evaluated on accuracy. And so is the bot providing feedback on the
Yep.
accuracy of their reporting, so that they're getting some back and forth that way to even maybe hone their understanding even better? Or...
Yes. And here's an example where, every time it says, okay, explain this back to me, and if they don't have it right, it will gently correct them. There was one person gave us feedback last week and said, hey, bot, I don't think you know what you're talking about. She thought it was hallucinating. And the bot gently said, well, this is the lesson. It was like first gear or something. And then she said, no, I think you're really hallucinating. And so it quoted, because we trained it on the transcripts. So it quoted the exact thing that I said in the module. And then you see this pause in the time, right? Because you see it, bot spoke at this time, person spoke at this time. And then there's this pause, and she comes back and apologizes to the bot. She went back and checked the module.
Interesting.
So I say that because this was interesting to us, because to me, this is where it says, okay, at this point in time, and I don't know how long that will last, people really don't trust bots, right? I don't trust bots. We shouldn't trust bots. So when you're going to deliver content, have that delivered by an expert, right? like a teacher. So people know that it's actually being delivered by a person in a way that, hopefully the person knows what they're talking about. And then the bot can quiz them on it, and then it can bring up the quote if they don't believe the bot.
Yeah. So when you're building your large language model, which for those that don't know, that's sort of like the pool of data of content that the bots are drawing off of. And it matters a lot about what goes into that large language model. So if you're just doing it off everything on the web and it's taking Reddit posts and Wikipedia posts and everything, you're going to get evidence from that. But I know you've been quite careful with guardrails on what goes into those large language models. And could you maybe share what you're allowing in for these bots to draw off of so that you can assure as high quality output as possible?
Yeah, to me, this is critical, and I'm sure any MBSR teacher that's watching this who has played with any of these bots, any of these conversational agents, is like, teach me meditation. It's like the summation of every Reddit thread where somebody has talked about or guided meditation. It's very, I'll just say it's pretty superficial. Let's just put it that way. It's not like it's telling people to go do things that aren't meditate. Well, some, you'd question. Let's just say it's not what I would recommend. I'm sure not what a lot of other folks would recommend. So we say, don't do that. don't go to your, 8 billion or trillion parameters or whatever, but only use this. So we specifically say you can only use the stuff that we give you. And you can only train on that, and you can only quiz people on that. And that has been extremely helpful in it not going sideways, but
Yeah.
also preserving the conversational nature of these agents, right? The fact that they feel human-like, that's the big breakthrough.
Hmm.
So we can keep that piece because that's really good. And we can also build in memory and all this stuff so that they remember previous conversations.
Mm.
But the guardrails are the critical piece. And also, I will say from the ethical standpoint, we also built in um, both bots that monitor the bots for safety issues, but also everything's monitored by a human, and importantly, by a trained clinician. At some level, so these things can get flagged for me to check, and I can check them really quickly. And so we can
Mm.
actually, we can outsource some of the early screening piece to a bot, which makes it scalable. And the bots can put it up the chain and say, hey, this language looks concerning. Check it out. And I actually have these alerts set to my phone because we want to be very, very careful at this point.
Hmm. Yeah. Can you give an example of like a flag that's come up and how you addressed it and then also what it means in terms of improving the AI tool?
Great question. Right, I could check. I haven't looked lately, but
Yeah.
right now we have set our flags as to capture everything. So they're very sensitive, but they're not that specific yet. And
Yeah.
fortunately, we haven't had any instances where we've actually been concerned. So I don't have a specific one where somebody was suicidal or something like that, and I
Yeah.
had to intervene immediately. It's picking up language where that is like way in the periphery, which is
Yeah.
great because we can then start to bring it down, tighten it up, tighten it up, tighten it up. So
Yeah.
what the thing, we've got a bunch of different guardrails that we're starting to build in. So it's like, we can start with the basic things like safety and then get into other, therapeutic alignment and, trust. And there are actually frameworks out there now that we can build into this where it's checking a bunch of different parameters at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So cool. I'm just going to turn to some questions
Hmm.
that were submitted from some of the participants either before this started as people were registering and submitting their questions, and then we also have them being pulled now as well. But one shared, looking ahead, where do you see the biggest opportunities for innovation in mindfulness-based digital health, and what's not being built yet that should be? And that particularly that last bit of what's not being built yet that should be.
Well, I would say it starts with safety. So what's not being built yet? I mean, we're just playing with this ourselves. There should be a bunch of teams all working on this independently or together so that these frameworks can be built because we have a certain window right now. And there's some folks that had a technology thing last week where they were talking about this. Like, there's a window, especially around mental health, where things are going to get locked down. And so building in these safety frameworks, I would say, is one of the critical first pieces that I haven't seen really built in yet. So that's the first piece. The
Yeah.
second piece is, I would say, really bringing in, like, what do we actually know around the mechanisms and the evidence for, whatever somebody wants to approach, whether, we're starting with anxiety, but it could be depression. It could, there's so much good work with MBCT, et cetera. So if somebody wanted to build, and I'm sure people are, so building these, conversational agents around depression, I would say really having a framework for making sure there's guardrails for, really training on the evidence base and the actual stuff that has been shown to work as compared to Reddit threads.
Mm.
People are just playing around with that. It's early days.
Yeah, yeah. Remember when you first came to the mindfulness center, you shared this conversation of where it's like when something first starts, it's almost like concrete that's been poured and you can still shape it. And then over time, it starts to solidify. And it may be like that right now with the digital therapeutics using AI. Is it still malleable right now? And so how can we put in those guardrails to make it as safe as possible while still honoring and facilitating the therapeutic outcomes? And
Yeah.
yeah. Um, Someone shared, you're someone who's grounded in science, but also deeply engaged with contemplative practice. And so, how do you personally navigate the tension or the synergy between ancient wisdom and modern tech?
Okay. Great question. I'm so glad that that's brought forward. So first, I'll say, I have so much gratitude for these ancient practices and having been exposed to these, or in my 20s. And so, like, I can't think of a single research question that I've asked that wasn't like a technical one in, say, the last decade, that wasn't just pulled right out of the suttas. It's like, okay, so we even wrote a paper back in 2013 on the links between dependent origination and reinforcement learning. And so I would say, looking at these in terms of the synergy, I'm not sure that we've actually come up with anything new in modern day. I would say we're applying or kind of rediscovering, it's like old wine in new bottles. We're rediscovering what the Buddhist psychologists were talking about thousands of years ago. So I'm profoundly grateful for that. And in that sense, I can't think of a tension that has arisen, because it's like, well, let's test this. And if we set it up rigorously, if the answer is yes, we'll learn something. If the answer is no, we'll learn something. And setting the dial on, well, hypothesis is it's yes. It's been yes every time. I mean, it's not like the Buddha predicted default mode network deactivation, but it happens to be a self-referential network. Well, Buddha had a lot to say about the self, you know.
Mm,
So in attachment and craving and all of this stuff. So there hasn't been tension, and just a lot of synergy, a lot of gratitude, because I've learned so much from the practice that we can then apply in the science and ask questions about this, and then have
mm,
that science feedback both to the practice for me personally, but also clinically, where I can apply these in my clinic and see if it helps people.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's like with a lot of wisdom traditions, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever, they've been passed on for thousands of years. And there's probably a good reason for that, and that it's helping people feel better.
Yeah.
And so like say thousands of years ago, we didn't have much in the way of like ultra processed foods. And people were getting much more nature experience. And there was less sedentary activities available to us and less screens and you know and
This
so
many screens, right?
yeah,
Zero.
exactly. Other than maybe your reflection in a clear lake or something, I don't know. But and so yeah, maybe a lot of these strategies that have stood the test of time have done so because they can just apply to whatever's coming up in current society. And I think that's one of the things that you are really good at is not shying away from the biggest challenges in society, whether say it's addiction or emotional eating or anxiety or digital addiction, and really harnessing that and helping make sense of it so that, for the 2,000 people that signed up for this that are even going to watch it live or to watch it afterwards because it's being recorded, I think it's a great service. I'm really grateful that you do that.
Thank you.
We had a question come in from Shannon, who said, if we can agree that developing mindfulness as a trait can give clarity or a more objective view of reality, how can we reframe the discussion around mindfulness as a protective factor in the ongoing algorithmic war on our minds and conscious experiences without causing alarm? Or is an alarm needed at this point?
I'd be curious how you'd answer that. And so I would say it's alarming regardless whether it's needed or not. I think the alarm is sounding for a lot of people. And if I'm understanding this question, and I might not be, but these protective factors, it's like these practices help us learn how our minds work. And so we can start to see these habit patterns of how we're getting, how these digital technologies, for example, are designed to addict us, right? There's a ton of work on that. And so if they're designed to addict us, the only immunization, think of it as like if they're trying to infect us, the immunization is about training our minds. Well, we train our minds by learning how our minds work. And so we can actually leverage the same process that sucks us in to help protect us and become a protective factor. So to me, it really seems that these really simple like goals of like, hey, understand your mind and notice how your mind is pulled or pushed is one of the best protective factors that we can develop for anything that comes up in the future. I don't know. How would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think of the algorithms as also feeding us into paths that we may be interested in, but that can then lead to narrower channels of non-overlapping knowledge so that it can lead to more polarization in society. And so it seems that polarization is not awesome. Uh,
Agreed.
and how can we promote communication across the poles? Because actually differentiation and deep knowledge in a narrow field is awesome, because look at you, you've gone deep into the intersection of mindfulness, meditation, digital therapeutics, artificial intelligence, and now you're sharing this to the world, and that's a gift. And so I think it's when we get into who's right and who's wrong, the dichotomous stuff that gets challenging. And I think mindfulness training can help us like just take a step back to know that algorithms exist, that we have a certain amount of information. We can't possibly know everything in the world. And can we look at things with curiosity around other people's perspectives? I'm just looking at the poster behind you right now that says "Oh" with an exclamation mark. And so if someone shares something, notice what the O is, and then can we meet it with curiosity that then can actually help us bridge across those disciplines and those bodies of knowledge that maybe the algorithms guided us down to really make sure that we're having that transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary knowledge sharing, that actually that's where all the innovation happens, is when different disciplines meet. And what's the magic between those disciplines when they do?
I think that I really like that, and it reminds me of information, right? So I saw this clinically, especially over the last couple of weeks, but it's been ongoing for a little while, where people have information anxiety. And actually, I wrote a Substack article about this if folks want to go into it more. But I was seeing this so much clinically, looked into it, and it's like, oh, our brains are actually they need information to survive, right? And so there's this tension between, like information to our brain is like food to our stomach, and both actually give dopamine signals that reinforce like, hey, get more information. But we can't drink from the entire fire hose of the internet, and we have misinformation and disinformation that weren't even there for our ancient ancestors. Well, um,
Might have been, but
yeah, I was
more
gonna say
formed.
there's never, my wife, who's an ancient scholar, was pointing out how like even in ancient history there like people were making cases for themselves. Let's just put it that way. If you look at the things in the Bible. So here we can learn. It's like food, right? When you're hungry, you eat and it tastes good, and then there's this pleasure plateau that we hit when our body's saying that was enough. And if we just eat mindlessly, we go over that cliff of overindulgence. We do the same with information. So it's like, okay, I need to learn about this. But then we can start asking, do I really need to go down this rabbit hole of whatever the news thing du jour is? And so instead of going, oh no, I need to know more, we can ask, well, what am I getting from going over this cliff of overindulgence and go, oh, and ask ourselves, okay, maybe I've learned enough of this topic, you know?
Yeah.
So I think especially today, this is so relevant for learning how to just be in our digital world that's trying to pull us this way and that way.
Hmm.
And I'll add one last thing that in the Buddhist sutras, they talk about attachment to views causing suffering, right? And so they're even talking about these root cause like division or, like I'm right, you're wrong. It was clearly spelled out way before we had disinformation and misinformation and polarizing and all these algorithms that get us divisive. They
Hmm.
knew where that would go without even having those algorithms in place.
Yeah. Yeah. Just thinking about as a little test for ourselves, can we notice, say, with a particular viewpoint, is it like rigid? Is there an element of clenching to it or an element of like openness? And if there's the openness there, that might be a healthier place to be, and the clenching or the rigidity might be a bit of a signal. And I know you've done some, or
Yeah.
maybe you're in the middle of it right now around the neural correlates of sort of open and closed states. And I know
Yeah.
we're getting pretty close to the end, but be curious, like some little snippets on your thinking around kind of open and closed states and why it's important for mental well-being and physical.
Yeah. Yeah, we're just finishing up a 3-year project looking at both behavioral and neural correlates of basically closed and contracted versus open and expanded states. And this actually came to me clinically where I was just over and over, like the language was consolidating around what was easiest for people to understand without having to get conceptual. And so, for example, anybody that's watching or listening can ask themselves, if I feel anxious, does it feel more closed and contracted or open and expanded, right? And so those are the types of experiments we did. If I feel, connected with people, do I feel closed and contracted, open and expanded? So it's actually pretty straightforward and pretty uniform, at least across English-speaking populations that we've looked at. We've looked at hundreds of people. And so behaviorally, there seems to be a marker that's somewhat, let's call it neutral, that can help people see their experience. And it's not like they're not judging it as good or bad. It's not like it's pleasant or unpleasant. Well, these tend to correlate with pleasant and unpleasant, but they can really focus on like what's it feel to feel like when I'm closed? What's it feel like when I'm open? And then they can link up the cause and effect. So when I'm anxious or when I'm yelling at somebody, it tends to feel closed. And how does that feel? Does it feel better or worse than when I'm open, right? And so it's probably baked into our DNA that these open states are more rewarding, thank goodness, because compassion and kindness and connection are more rewarding than division and anger and hatred, right?
Hmm.
So here we can not only use these as ways to just start to get more curious about our experience in a way that's not, that doesn't get caught up in our old conditioning, but also maybe a therapeutic modality as well. We haven't gotten to the therapeutic side yet. We're starting to build that in. Well, that's not true. We built this into our anxiety program, and we've actually built this into our Going Beyond Anxiety program as a core piece of giving people the experiential markers to be looking for when they're mapping out their habit loops around anxiety, procrastination, frustration, and also around their habit loops around curiosity. Oh, what does that feel like, right? It feels open. So
Yeah.
for us, it's very pragmatic. In fact, I
Mm.
have something I learned from my old mentor, where he'd always ask me, "So what?" whenever I came up with a new research question. And the "so what" meant if you can't show how this is going to be pragmatically useful for people, like outside of the ivory towers, then I'm going to suggest that you keep going, finding a question that is pragmatic. And so I actually now all my lab members have to answer the "so what" question before they start a new project. And to me, this keeps it grounded in reality because everything has to circle back to helping people, not just like, oh, here's an interesting academic question that doesn't really matter. I
Yeah.
mean, might matter to some people, but doesn't push the needle on a population level.
Yeah. Yeah. So such an important question. I'd love to keep going, but I know time is coming near to the end of this session. We typically end this seminar series with a similar closing question too. So I'd be curious to hear, looking ahead to the future, where do you see the study and practice of mindfulness best serving humanity?
Well, I think it's our only hope. What's the Star Wars when Princess Leia goes, "Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. Help me, awareness and curiosity, you're my only hope." And I say that because, there's this quote from the Dalai Lama, like if every kid who was 8 learned mindfulness, all wars would stop in one generation or something like that. And so this is where I truly believe that like this is the thing, learning how our minds work, learning how to work with our minds, because it will help us see how painful it is when we're divisive, when we're a jerk, when we're selfish. And it will help us see just how it's not even a question to be of service when we see how rewarding it is to be connected, kind, and helping others in whatever way we do that to serve the world.
Mhm.
So uh, I really see this as I don't know anything else that's going to help because there's nothing else that's as direct in helping people really get at the root of the problem, whatever the problem is, right? Whatever we're sucked in, whatever form of self-centeredness it is, because they're all tend to be derivatives.
Mhm.
And then what it feels like to really step outside of ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think of neuroimaging studies that I understand have showed that, of all the different emotions out there, they can hit pleasure centers like hatred and judgment can hit some pleasure centers. But the biggest one that's most pleasurable, my understanding, is love. And mindfulness training can help us truly see cause and effect of when we engage in certain practices, what the results are. And thank goodness, love is one of the highest ones for the human race and the planet as a whole. But I think part of what we can do with these contemplative practices is to just truly see cause and effect and start to see the truth of how things operate and then respond skillfully to that truth. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm sure folks are really going to appreciate the wisdom that you shared and your ability to really harness, ancient wisdom and really bring it into today through technology or clinical applications, and always keeping that question in mind of like, so what? Like really, how can this be of service? And to use that as guardrails even on your own research to be asking the big questions of our time that are truly innovative. So thank you, and can turn it over to Fran for any conclusions too.
Thank you so much, Judd and Eric, for leading us in such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. It could have easily gone another hour or two. And thank you to everyone who took the time to log on today and engage in the dialogue. I was reading through the dozens of questions submitted. We had over 600 people logged on today, and I was just blown away by the level of thought and engagement that everyone brought to this. And I really wish that we could have gotten to more questions. So we'll have to do a second edition. And I really hope today's session offered something meaningful for everyone's own practice and teaching and curiosity. A quick reminder that the session was recorded. We'll share a link in a follow-up email and put it on our YouTube playlist soon. And before we close, I just wanted to share a sneak preview of what the next speaker series event is going to be. We'll be joined by anthropologist, MBSR teacher, and peace builder Paula Ramirez on November 5th, who she has worked in over 20 countries, including the United Nations, working with the United Nations as co-founder of Respira in Colombia. And in conversation, will be led in conversation by our very own Lynn Kerbel. So Paula will explore how mindfulness-based programs can honor local traditions, cultural worldviews, and ancestral practices, asking what becomes possible when mindfulness is adapted with humility and care. So we hope that you'll be able to join us, what promises to be a rich and deeply meaningful dialogue.
Now, Paula is remarkably courageous and open and has some really important and interesting angles in this field because she's been engaging with so many diverse populations and is an excellent communicator about some of the
Mm.
kernels of insights that come from those populations and those experiences. So I'm personally really looking forward to that session too.
With that, I will sign off and just thank you again, Jud and Eric and everyone, and be well, everyone. Take care.